Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about China in period 3 today, and we're going to be focusing primarily on the Tang and Song dynasties. Now, first off, just as an overview, it's important for us to realize that just like the Han Dynasty, the Tang and Song dynasties represent a real golden age for China. During the time of these dynasties, China enjoys great wealth, political stability, as well as a flourishing of the arts and education. China also dominates East Asia, so we'll look at some maps throughout these videos. What's important for us to realize is that despite the fact that they have, of course, political boundaries, they also have influence over areas even outside of their political borders. And those are called tribute states. We'll talk about those more, but essentially, China also controls Korea, Japan, and Vietnam during this era, even if it is not direct political control. And they also developed vibrant and distinctive cultural traditions, even in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, but they also adapt them to their own pre existing culture. And these questions are just for us to think ahead on. And of course, as you're taking notes, if that's what you're doing, keep in mind ways in which the information we discuss addresses these questions here. All right, so as I was saying earlier, this is a true golden age for China. We're going to talk about the Sui Dynasty briefly, but I want us to focus primarily on the sizes of both the Tang and the Song Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty comes first. Notice first how far west it extends. This actually is past the present day political borders of China. So they're going into present day Kazakhstan in this map. One of the reasons why that is because despite the fact that the Han Dynasty has fallen, the silk trade is still very important. And so by controlling this area, the Chinese also still have a lot of security over the silk trade routes. Additionally, you can see that their northern border really doesn't go too far north of the Great Wall because they already have that defense network built in. If we look at the southern border, they are going into present-day Vietnam. And I'll discuss why they have influence over Korea and Japan as well, even if that's not in their territory. And then we'll talk about the Song Dynasty, which is highlighted in blue. That is smaller than the Tang Dynasty, but still very influential. So let's just do a recap back to period 2 ever so briefly and remind ourselves of what China was like before. So you hopefully will recall the Han Dynasty. This was another golden age in China. It lasted for about 400 years. It also lasted at the same time as the Roman Empire. So it was rivaling the Roman Empire in terms of wealth and strength and power. The Han Dynasty collapses in 220 CE, and then after that you have a 400-year period of instability and anarchy. So this isn't just an immediate turnaround into the next dynasty. During this period, trade is reduced, of course, and there's great political turmoil after that. And the next dynasty that forms doesn't form until 581 CE. That's the Sui Dynasty. And the Sui Dynasty is also not particularly stable, actually. I'm just going back briefly so we see the Sui Dynasty on the map. Okay, so eventually the Sui is going to replace where the Han used to be. Even though the Sui Dynasty was short-lived, it does begin a very important accomplishment in terms of Chinese infrastructure. So the Sui Dynasty is known for the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal really is a tremendous achievement of early architecture, engineering, and design. Architecture, not so much. I don't know why I said that. In any case, this Grand Canal, once it was completed, was about 2,700 miles long. It took less than 10 years to complete, and it involved thousands of peasants who were building this canal. Many of them worked for many years, and we call them peasants, but you may notice the wording here. It does say that they were forced to work on the canal. So we can infer from that that despite the fact that these people were peasants, if they're forced to do this labor in many ways, we could consider them to be doing slave labor. The purpose of this canal initially was military. They wanted to connect the Yangtze River, the Yangtze River to the south to the Yellow River of the north. So it eventually has more of a significance for trading. And as you can see here, there are also other canals that are built, but essentially, once this canal was completed, it goes essentially all the way to Beijing in the north and then Hangzhou in the south. So it would be the equivalent. I'm speaking here from Connecticut right now. I'm not the best with miles, but I'm thinking that if I got in my car right now and I drove to Las Vegas, that would be about how long this canal is. One of the other things about the Sui Dynasty, it's not written down here, but I did mention that this is a short-lived dynasty that lasts less than 40 years. The emperor of the Sui dynasty, his name is Sui Yangdi, so Yangdi, and he unifies China after that long period of instability by using violence and repression. So it's not surprising to us that this Grand Canal was built in such a violent way. We can also really compare it to the construction of the Great Wall, right? So realize that peasants, even if they are not technically slaves, are treated as such when they're building these projects. And here's a more modern view of the canal. Nowadays, it's not really efficient enough to carry some of the really large ships that we see transporting cargo, but ultimately is still used at a local level. And it's just fascinating. And if you want, you could pause this video here if you want to read some more statistics about this canal. So let's move on to the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, we saw it on the map before, but just as a brief recap, it is, first off, it lasts much longer than the Sui Dynasty, and it is much more influential than the Sui Dynasty. During this dynasty, which is roughly 300 years long, it experiences a lot of prosperity and stability, especially when compared to that long period after the Han Dynasty. And rulers actually extend the territory of the Chinese Empire during the Tang Dynasty. So as I said earlier, we're seeing that it's actually going really far west in this time period. At the height of the Tang Dynasty, it extended west all the way to Central Asia. I said earlier, I believe this is present-day Kazakhstan, and all the way west, or rather north to Manchuria, and south into modern-day Vietnam. So the other thing is that they expand their trade networks. We know that they are very interested in land trade, but they are also expanding into water trade, and one of the countries that they're interested in trading with is Japan. So despite the fact that they don't actually directly control Japan, they are increasing their contact with them, and therefore they're really influencing Japanese culture, and this is a really significant indicator of how strong the Tang Dynasty was. Another thing that really shows us how strong the dynasty was the tribute system. Okay, so we see, sorry, this map is in Chinese. I can't read Chinese either, but I thought that it was a good demonstration of what a tribute state was. So the darker orange we see, these are areas that are controlled directly by the Chinese government. So we could see this really dark orange area as very centralized. Once we get to these areas that are sort of highlighted, not actually that deep, deep orange, we can consider these parts of the map to be tribute states. These places aren't technically part of China, but they still are influenced very heavily by China, and in some ways China controls them. So what is a tribute, you might ask? A tribute is essentially a tax or a gift that people in these tribute states have to give to the emperor. This isn't really a gift because it's not like they're opting to do it. The emperor demands tribute from the tribute states. And there are a number of things that these tribute states can get from the tribute. One of the things they can do sometimes is get military protection from the Chinese, but it's not a guarantee. So the tribute state definitely favors China over the tribute states, right? Another thing I failed to mention from previously is that oftentimes during the Tang and the Song Dynasty, for that matter, China was referred to as the Middle Kingdom. So the inference from that is that the whole world revolved around China and that it was the most important country in the entire world. One good example going back to tribute states here is Korea. So Korea wasn't actually part of the Tang Dynasty, but they had to pay tribute to the emperor. And what that does is it actually really influences Korean society, and it actually, in some instances, creates stability and trade for these regions. So the Koreans, by having this strong connection to the Chinese, the Vietnamese also have this connection. oftentimes when the empire is going well, they can benefit from that relationship. Another thing that the tribute states have to do is exercise kowtow, which is a practice of paying respect to the emperor. This involves bowing down so low that your head actually reaches the ground. So actually, this is them. This is kowtow right there. This is them bowing. We can't see the emperor in this image. And if you don't kowtow to the emperor, that is considered a sign of great disrespect. So some of the things that happened during the Tang Dynasty, and some of these things actually continue into the Song Dynasty, is in terms of infrastructure, we see a great expansion of transportation networks. Roads are extended and improved. This is a really cool picture. This is a very, very ancient Chinese trading road that we see still exist. And we can also infer that when you get super far west in China, the terrain is pretty treacherous. So this was not an easy thing to do. We already talked about canals in the Sui Dynasty. The Grand Canal actually was expanded during the Tang Dynasty. And also they develop a postal service, which is obviously another way that you can really work on centralizing your government, right, to exchange information in an efficient way. And also don't forget that the Chinese were certainly not the first people to develop a postal service. The first thing that came to my mind was the Persians along the Royal Road, right? So if you're thinking about continuity and change or comparison, you could certainly mention that. The Tang Dynasty, for the first time in hundreds of years, has a centralized government, a powerful one at that. They bring back the civil service exam, which we already know from period 2. We should remember that this is a very Confucian idea that stresses hard work over nepotism, over family connections. And the other thing that happens because the civil service exam is brought back is that many schools and universities are built, and the specific purpose of these schools is to prepare students to take the civil service exam. So we can definitely tell that that things are getting more stable during the Tang Dynasty. Another thing we should be aware of is that Buddhism is continuing to spread into China, and actually it grows considerably during the Tang Dynasty. And part of that is because there was one particular scholar, we see him here, his name was Zhuangzhang, and he is already Buddhist, but he decides to go on a pilgrimage to India, right? He actually ends up staying there for 17 years. He studies in a Buddhist monastery and at a very famous Buddhist university called Nalanda University. It still exists, actually. Very, very famous center for Buddhist knowledge. And after 17 years, he goes back to China, and he's a celebrity the moment he gets back. And when he gets back, he also brings lots of Buddhist texts with him, and he spends the rest of his life actually translating those texts into Chinese. So his writings actually leave a longer legacy than he actually did in life, because of course when you die, your writings don't go with you. All right, so how did the Tang Dynasty fall? One of the major, but not only, reasons why the Tang Dynasty fell was because, surprise, surprise, we have more internal rebellion. Do you see a pattern here? In any case, An Lushan, he was a military leader, and he already sees that there's signs of weakness in the Tang Dynasty. This had started back in the 8th century or so, and actually in the middle of the 8th century, that's when An Lushan's rebellion takes place. So An Lushan raises a very considerable army, about 100,000 soldiers, and they end up overthrowing the emperor. And they are not fully successful, however, because despite the fact that they oust the emperor, an army of Uyghurs comes in and actually stops the rebels and then reinstills the Tang government in power. And I wanted to explain to you what Uyghurs are, because this word may be new to you. So Uyghurs actually are some semi-autonomous people that live in Western China. They still do live in Western China. Many of them are Turkish in ancestry, and many of them are also Muslim. And so the Uyghurs actually are not really seen as Chinese, even though they live within China's borders. So the Uyghurs actually are really the people who kind of come in and save the day for the Tangs. And so because of that, the Tangs actually they are forced to pay the Uyghurs tribute, and this happens until the end of the Tang Dynasty. So despite the fact that the Uyghurs sweep in and save them, so to speak, it really indicates that the Tang Dynasty is not going to ever be the same power that it was, because now the Tang is dependent on the Uyghurs for military protection. Also, this war, it's hard to really pinpoint exact specifics, but there are some studies that argue that this was one of the deadliest wars in human history. The casualties were in the millions, and some estimate within the tens of millions. So obviously, this is going to do significant damage to the population, to the agricultural yield. So nonetheless, it's probably not surprising to us that after the Tang Dynasty falls, we have this period of instability yet again, but it's not as long as the period of instability between the Han and the Tang. Okay, so just this is the last slide in this segment. We'll do a part two. But this interim period, it has two names. Some people call it the period of 5 dynasties. It's also called the period of 10 kingdoms, and it's 53 years long. But what I think is interesting is that just that period there is actually longer than the entire Sui Dynasty, right? And what we'll pick up with next video is how the Song Dynasty then reunites China, how long it rules, how significant that was, and then we'll also recap with a general summary of culture and society, as well as the role of women in both the Tang and the Song dynasties. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.